couple of maps, I should say, it'll help a little bit in what we're looking at tonight. We'll leave this one up for the most part the whole time, but let me go ahead and run through just a couple of them. This first one here is just normal. It's where we are currently in time, and the parts of it that I think are important to recognize, and hopefully they're able to see this online. But down here, this little small blue strip above the purple one, that little bit of land is what we call the Gaza Strip. And so all of the rockets that have been coming out lately that we've seen over the last few weeks, I'm not really even going to deal with that tonight, but where they've been going, what's been interesting is that they've made it up as far north as Tel Aviv. And that's an interesting escalation because they haven't really had rockets that could get there with any kind of accuracy, and even at that, they were very seldom could they get that far. Usually they go up a little further up the coast to Ashdod, Ashkelon, places like that. And when we go to Israel, the one place that we get to that is kind of within range is Beersheba. And but we're not there long, and there are places that you can go to. And again, if there were escalations, we wouldn't be going there. But right there is a very important place of interest. What is commonly referred to as the West Bank is the purple part within Israel. You see that the purplish looking thing right there above the Dead Sea or to the left of the Dead Sea? That's what is known as the West Bank. And there's a map that I'll show you right after this that kind of helps us in our understanding of it. And then up there towards the top where you see Syria and you look directly over to the left of it, that purplish color, not the purple like there's a difference of what, lavender versus the other one. There's the light and the dark, okay? So the one that is right there by, yeah, there you go, right there next to the Sea of Galilee, that is the Golan Heights. And so that's going to come up in our discussion a little bit tonight. So those are three very contentious areas. The one that is simply the biggest of the problems is the Golan, the Golan Heights, because of its strategic placement, and the fact that it's becoming a political topic because we've recognized it as a country. We've recognized Israel's right to it. But the Gaza Strip, that tiny little bit of land right there, is going to be a real problem going forward. It always has been. Now, for the first time, our country is taking a different approach to the whole land for peace thing. And so we're about to roll out a peace plan. And it's an interesting thing because they're trying to do it from a totally different angle than they've done before. And so I have an article on that, which I think you'll find interesting. Let's go to the next map, and we'll put this one up for the remainder of the time. This here, you hear them talk a lot about going back to borders. And you'll see something is said from Mahmoud Abbas. He's the head of the Palestinian Authority, or what became the leftovers of the PLO under Yasser Arafat. Now they're called a different name, same terrorists, but one of them's wearing a suit instead of a kufiya. So do you guys know what kufiyas are? That's the little head thing that Arafat used to wear. Abbas doesn't wear one, but he's still a terrorist. So that's provocative, right? No, it's just truth. So here you'll see why those are so contentious. The same places, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, before 1967 were under the control of Jordan and Egypt, okay? And then the Golan Heights were also in dispute. These are still very contentious things, and when you hear them talking about going back to original borders, this is what they mean. So Gaza is, okay, no big deal. Israel gave that back years ago, and unfortunately, it was immediately taken over by Hamas terrorists, and they run everything there. What you have in the West Bank strategically, when we go to visit there, if I'm pointing out to you, especially when we get around Jerusalem, what would happen if that went back into the hands of terrorists, you would understand that from a strategic point of view, that would be insanity. It would definitely be insane to do it up in the north in the Golan Heights. So newsflash, they're not going back to any other borders. While we're talking about borders, let me show you one other photograph, and this is the borders that God gave the nation. You want to know what World War III would look like? Let's talk about borders. And so if we were worried about what the original borders would be according to Genesis 15, the green lines tell you what that is. So it's the Euphrates to the Nile, and snap a line across the bottom of both of those. Now, can you imagine if Israel said, you know what, deal, let's go back to the original borders? That would be an interesting day. But I just want to make sure that we understand this by perspective, what it really looks like. These are really very, very interesting when you take them into account, what really is, what really would take place if we went back to original borders. So we'll go back to the first photo. And I'll keep it up there because this is modern Israel. And we'll go back there in just a moment. Yeah, there you go. So we've done a whole presentation on this, a PowerPoint that we did kind of looking at the modern state of Israel. And if you haven't had a chance to see it, I'm sure we probably have it recorded on YouTube. But I don't want to do that for tonight because what I'd like to be able to do with you is to kind of look at some things happening right now in the world around us. There is much happening as far as the news is concerned, and I wanted to kind of go over some of those things with you. Now, I think there is sometimes a danger in trying to make Bible studies around the news. But I think it is grab the newspaper and let's find something that fits in the Bible. Not what I think we should be doing. What I think we ought to do is, again, we're here Sunday nights. Sunday nights is when we're studying through the Old Testament, and if you're studying through the Old Testament, you're looking at the history of Israel, God's covenant people. So once you get past Genesis, and then you get into the land that was ultimately taken by them, it happens when they come back to populate the land. We think after Exodus, when they come in with Joshua, this is when they really start to realize and populate the land that God had promised all the way back to Abraham, but now they do so under a law. So that means that God has not only established a covenant with a people, but that people now has a covenant with a land, and they had a covenant with God in the law that he gave them that would govern them. So with all that being said, we study that in Sunday nights, and it is really important that now in church history, for the first time, starting last century, in the middle part of last century, the church is now able to speak about Israel as now reestablished in the land. And it is no mistake. And I'll show you why that is important, and I'll show you why the scripture said that it would be so. And so I thought it would be kind of fun to go through this tonight with you. Let's turn to the book of Amos. And an interesting thing, when you look through this minor prophet, he's got so many things to say that really kind of hit right at the heart of what our discussion will be about tonight. So we're going to excerpt from him a few different verses, but we're going to start at chapter 3. Now, again, the question that we could ask is, why does any of this matter? And the thing about Scripture, as you've heard me say so often over these weeks in all of our studies, is how God communicates to mankind, and he does so in a way that's unique in all of the beliefs of mankind. So all of the different beliefs that man have some kind of a written thing that they say it's the basis or it's the element of what gives them, the belief that they have. So with Islam, it is the Quran and the Hadiths and the biography of Muhammad. Those are their sacred books, and the different belief systems have their different sacred writings, and it's the basis for what they believe. The Bible is incredibly unique because it reveals a God who is personal, and he is personally given revelation to so many different people through so many ages in different parts of the world, and God has spoken in kind of with one voice of all the same messages. And he tells you, one of the things again that is unique about the scripture is that God will tell you of events before they take place with real detail. And that is what sets him apart from all the other beliefs. So there are these apocalyptic or prophetic, if you will, beliefs in other religions, but they're incredibly generalized. They're like, there aren't very many specifics. In this, you get some specifics. And so when we look at the world around us, again, I can't believe it, within our own ranks, within Calvary Chapel, sometimes people say, we need to back away from this stuff. We shouldn't be talking so much about it. Well, then you're going to kind of take the world out of its context, and that's kind of a messed up thing to do, especially when the scripture spends so much time talking about it. we are, I believe personally, on the cusp, and have been for a generation, at the fulfillment of a prophecy that Ezekiel had given. We're not going to spend a lot of time there, but let me just address a couple of big highlighted things. Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39 are very, very common as we talk about prophecy. What I want to focus in on, most importantly, are the participants in it. Now, again, it would take a whole night just to try to track down the different names of the different groups of people, and there are plenty of studies out there that do a very competent job of that. But what you will find is it's pretty much most of northern Africa, except for Egypt, and it is much of what we would call the Middle East. And so, with a few exceptions, you know, Iraq is an exception. There are a couple of other exceptions. But you have such huge geographical areas, and two of the biggest participants, though the first two mentioned, is remnants of what we would call the Soviet Union or Russia and Iran. And so because of them figuring so prominently, it's interesting seeing their comings and goings in the Middle East right now as we currently look at it. So the rest of the group that comes against Israel is what, at the time that Ezekiel would have written about it, didn't even exist, at least as far as something that would be a rallying cry for them. It exists in our day, and so as you look at those nations that will ultimately come against Israel and who are making the most noise currently, the one thing that unites them is what? Hate and Islam. That did not exist in Ezekiel's time. So that didn't come around for 1,000 years from Ezekiel's writings. And so it is an interesting thing when you look and you'd say, what commonality is there between all of northern Africa, all the way up into Russia, as far into Europe as Turkey and that area, and then as far over to the east as, say, Iran and Pakistan and Afghanistan and those areas there? That's pretty interesting because that's not common language. It is not common race. It's not common anything. What they have in common is Islam. And so that will be a lot of the news that we read about tonight that I think you'll find kind of interesting. So with all of that said, let's have a word of prayer and let's take a look at a few of these verses. Father, we thank you as you open our eyes and our understanding to your word. We would ask that we would be willing to hear what you have to say to us, and really on the lookout for when these events will take place, recognizing that our redemption and the return of Jesus is very closely related in time to these matters. We ask, Lord, that we would not be people who are watching television and watching the news, but we are people who are able to account for when it happens and when we hear it. But we wait, and our expectation is for you, and that we would use these beliefs that we have and these scriptures that prove that you know the things before they take place. We would use it as a platform that we would make you known to the world. We thank you. We ask that you would be glorified in the teaching of your word tonight. And as we study through the scriptures and look at the world around us, that we would see you've told these things in advance. And so again, we give you all thanks. We give you praise. Lead us and guide us by your Spirit, we pray tonight in Jesus' name. Amen. Here's a really cool thing that was said in the book of Amos. It's found in chapter 3, and look at what it says in verse 7. Chapter 3, verse 7 of the book of Amos says this: "Surely the Lord God does nothing unless he reveals his secret to his servants, the prophets. A lion has roared, and who will not fear? The Lord God has spoken, who can but prophesy?" What an interesting statement, but it is an interesting thing that God says here through Amos, that God doesn't do things unless he tells you in advance. He lets you know of things in detail before they take place, so that the people who are paying attention and who care about such things could make any kind of preparations as they may. It also helps us to say, when we look at the world around us, we can say, well, God said that this would take place, and we don't want to be expert on the events. What we want to be expert on is to say when they pop up, oh yeah, God said so. By the way, let me tell you the other things that he said. You see? So it's wonderful that we are able to say, here's how he's different from all the other, quote, gods of all the other religions. He'll tell you what's going to happen before it happens. Now, alongside that, there is a bit of a problem that happens, and it happened in his day. Now, there are a few other verses that I'm going to show you from Amos, and it helps us in our understanding that we know when it was that he was writing. So he was writing if you look at the minor prophets and the major prophets too, from Isaiah to Jeremiah, Ezekiel to Daniel, and through the minor prophets, they are all writing in basically a 300, roughly 300 to 400 years span of time. And so what they were doing was telling you about things that were going to be taking place. Amos is early on in the history, and he's writing primarily to the north. So if we look back at this here, as the tribes populated the nation, what we would call Israel was in the northern parts. What we call Judah was in the lower parts. And at the time, Amos was writing to the northern, and the warnings were going to the north, more so than anything else. Here's how we know that. First of all, let's take a look at one other thing that was taking place. Chapter 8 tells us this in verse 11. This is a warning from the Lord through Amos, and he's telling them about what's about to take place, or what is actually happening in the land. I guess you could say it's kind of an assessment that God has of the people. And I think that it is happening today. If we make an application in modern terms, we could say, well, I wonder if this is happening today. Look at what verse 11 says. Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord God, that I will send a famine into the land. And it won't be a famine of bread, nor a famine for thirst of water, but of the hearing of the word of the Lord. Now, it's not that he won't speak. It's not that he's going to send a famine of the word, but of the hearing of the word. And so ultimately what that is, the people who are unwilling to hear, they're going to hear, and he's going to let them have what they're wanting. And I believe this is very much where the church is today. God has spoken about so many things, but the church says, I don't want to hear that. And the Lord says, well, great, I'm not going to pull your hands away from your ears. You can go ahead and do this la, la, la thing all that you want to. It doesn't change the fact that God has spoken. So it happened in this nation that we see the ravages of what took place. We know it historically. What happened to the north? Assyria. Assyria happened to the north. Now, I was watching a thing the other night. Again, do not ever get your theology from Discovery Channel or from the Travel Network or whatever else. Goodness gracious. They were looking at this thing about the, quote, lost tribes of Israel. Yeah, I can see a few of you as disgusted as I was. So they were saying, did the lost tribes actually come to America? Well, first of all, no, they weren't lost. They were absorbed for the most part, and they were integrated into the Assyrian thing, and many of them stayed in the north. For goodness sake, do some history, and you'll understand that that was why the southern tribes looked at the north with such disdain. It was why they hated Jesus so much. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? It's in Israel. Why do they have such a problem with it? They were seen as lesser. Oh my goodness. Like, so, you know, again, don't get your theology from secular sources. So God says there's going to be a drought. Now, how do we know who he's writing to? Look at chapter 1. And you'll see in the very first verse, it gives us the time of when this took place. And this is so important because of what we're going to look at the bookend of this. We're looking at chapter 1, verse 1. Chapter 1, verse 1 says, the word of the Lord that came to Joel. Joel, I went back too far. One book too far. The words of Amos. Okay, it's one. The words of Amos, who was among the sheep herders of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, the king of Judah. But that is also in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, the king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. Okay, so when was that? Okay, this is early on in Israel's history. So what's the chronology? Or what's the chain of custody of the kings? Saul, David, Solomon, Rehoboam, his son, in the south, Jeroboam in the north. One of the places I should have brought this picture up. One of the places I love going to, because it's tragic and informative at the same time, is to go into Dan up in the north, in the northernmost parts of Israel, and go and look at the ruins of Dan, one of the two places where this Jeroboam set up altars to the false gods. You can see it. When we go to Israel, we go to the foundational place where the altars were set up. Such an interesting thing when you stop to consider it. But Amos is writing at that time. Assyria is coming, and the warning that Amos is giving to them is get it together or else this time is coming. And it's like all of the prophets did. Guys, get it together. These prophets were sent by God to the people to give warning. Also, you'll notice at the end of the book, let's go to the very last chapter, chapter 9 in Amos. And let me recap what we've looked at so far. One of the first things that we looked at, or the first thing that we looked at, was God saying he doesn't do anything arbitrarily. What he'll do is tell you before these events happen, again, so that you will know. It's not that he just decides to do things on a whim. God will tell you these things before they take place. The problem with them, nobody wanted to hear. So God will certainly not make them. He'll send this drought. You guys want to not listen? Fine. I'll solidify you in that place. When was it taking place? In the very early times of the kings. So figure it this way. The northern tribe really only had 4 kings before it really started to go completely sideways. It went from being a united kingdom to a divided kingdom in Jeroboam, and they never recovered. Look at their history. They never had a good king, not one. So here's what God says. We know history. Assyria comes in and just lays waste to the north. Made it all the way, Assyria did, made it all the way to the south as far as the gates of Jerusalem, making all of their threats. And if not for the work of, or the administration, if you will, of Hezekiah and Isaiah, of asking God to preserve them, I believe Assyria would have very easily been able to take Jerusalem. But they did the right thing, and they came before God, and God fought the battles. Really, Assyria never recovered from it. They were wiped out overnight, pretty much. Their army was decimated, and the king goes back, and he dies in the house of his own gods. But it didn't mean that Israel got it together forever. And so what we do know is that through Nebuchadnezzar, the south ends up getting taken out. Nebuchadnezzar putting together the whole area around even what was the area of Assyria. And so much of the remnant of that ended up joining with him, and it really became a thing where God used that area of the world to judge Judah and to judge Jerusalem, as he had said anyway. Now, I don't want to go too much more into the history, but look at what is said here. This is vitally important that we understand this. In Amos chapter 9, look at verse 14. Here God says, I will bring back the captives of my people Israel. They shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink wine from them. They shall also make gardens and eat fruit from them. I will plant them in their land. No longer shall they be pulled up from the land that I have given to them, says the Lord your God. This, if you want a great verse to completely destroy replacement theology, here you have it. The essence of replacement theology is that the promises that are given to Israel have actually been taken by the church, and Israel was intended to just be a spiritual thing and not a literal thing once they rejected Jesus. Newsflash, God was talking about the dirt. I'm bringing them back to the dirt. Now this is Israel. He's referring to the people that are being judged by the Assyrians. Now here's my question. When did God ever do this? He didn't do it. 48 is the beginning of it. But until Israel is back in the land in our current understanding, this prophecy, this promise had been left unfulfilled. So if you were to ask a person, please, when you see God saying this, and God never fails, when did he ever bring Israel back to the land? You can say he brought Judah back after, but notice the second part of this, verse 15, I will plant them in their land, and no longer shall they be pulled up. So even if you want to say, well, he was talking about Judah. Yeah, but Judah got pulled up again, didn't they? At the hands of the Romans. Displaced for 100 years, or for 2,000 years, basically. And now they're back in the land. It's an amazing thing. So here you have a great prophecy where God says, this is what I'm going to do. Jeremiah, let's do one there, and then we'll take a look at some things happening in our world around us that are always interesting. Jeremiah chapter 30, very familiar. It's a verse that you hear quoted often. But what gets lost in it is a very interesting subtlety that's very easy to miss if you're not being careful. From Amos, we get this. God says, I will restore Israel. Again, that is That is the group of people that are being addressed by Amos. He's talking to the north. And so it says, God says Israel. So whether we want to say it's the north or if we want to say it's the combined Israel and Judah and a now again united nation, that he would bring them back into the land and they would never be displaced again. We know that that has never happened historically. I believe that the beginnings of it happened in 1948, and I do not believe that they will be uprooted, though there are many who would want that to be the case. Now, look at chapter 30 of Jeremiah. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Thus speaks the Lord God of Israel, saying, Write in a book for yourself all the words that I have spoken to you. For behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that I will bring back from captivity my people Israel and Judah. Both are mentioned here, not just one. Not just the north and the south. Once again, I would say to our replacement theology friends, when did this take place? We certainly know that it's not in a spiritual sense, and we're not talking spiritual Israel, because he mentions Israel and Judah by name, taking into account what Amos has already said. It's not about some spiritual covenant, it's about the dirt and the covenant made with the people and with the land, which is independent from the covenant that God made with them through the law. So the promise that he made to Abraham was forever. And when he talked about the land, it again was forever. So as you see this here, God says, I will bring back from captivity, where they've been scattered, that captivity is away in the nations, my people Israel and Judah, says the Lord. And I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they will possess it. Once again, you cannot make that a spiritual application. That is an application of people and land. And he never made a single covenant with any people in the history of man outside of Israel as being a people and a land combined together, and the two run hand in hand. It's a forever covenant. So look back at chapter 12, chapter 15, and all the promises that God made to Abraham, especially when he talks about the land itself. He reaffirms it with Jacob. He reaffirms it even with Joshua. So very important that we understand that. With that said, here we are in the 21st century. And now, even in our times, Israel is all over the news. It's a tiny little plot of land. I wish I had done it. If I was to show you, when you pan back away from everything, if you're to take a look at everything, say from like Europe all the way across over into Asia, if you were to pan it that far and maybe Russia to the tip of Egypt, and you try to find Israel, you need a magnifying glass. So how on earth is it that this tiny little place creates so much acid reflux for the rest of the world? Why is that? It's because they're a covenant people. And God said that they would be a cup of trembling. And so this cup of trembling, again, as Zechariah says that, he speaks about that in the prophetic sense at a future time from when he's writing. So, Trump vows to, quote, end Iran if it threatens the United States again. This happened just in the last few days. Now, some of you may have noticed we've sent ships into the area, and there have been a lot of interesting things. Now, I'm going to excerpt from a few articles here kind of heavily, but listen to this. Again, with all of what we just looked at, and it's just scratching the surface of the things that we would say prophetic. But now pay attention to just how the things that God said would take place are really starting to happen around us. President Trump threatened to destroy Iran in a tweet sent in the wake of reports that rocket was fired into Baghdad's heavily fortified green zone less than a mile away from the U.S. Embassy. Quote, if Iran wants to fight, that will be the official end of Iran. Never threaten the United States again, exclamation point, Trump tweeted. Now, as much as I would like to be able to say, yeah, if Iraq ever decides to pick a fight with us, of course they would lose that. They can't get anything here, but we could pretty much turn that whole country into glass if we wanted to. But the important part of this is that they are mentioned as one of the coalition members that come against Israel. So we will not be able to do what Trump says. So if we were to engage in war, God would have to supernaturally preserve those horrible people that are pulling the strings, because they will eventually be one of those groups that comes against Israel. Ezekiel makes that clear. The first in that coalition that joins in with Magog Gog and Magog, you know the whole Gog-Magog, there's the nation and then there's the person that leads them. Well, the first group that's mentioned is Persia. So, it is unclear exactly what prompted Trump's posting, but news outlets reported explosions in Iraq's capital, and a rocket launcher was discovered in eastern Baghdad, an area that is home to Iranian-backed Shiite militias. Here's the thing that most people don't really know a whole lot about. We hear Shiites and Sunnis, right? Those are the two branches of Islam. The dispersed, or you know how they're allotted numbers-wise. The Shiites account for about 18% of all Muslims. So over 80% of the world's Muslims are actually Sunni. So when you look at Iran, it has a Sunni government for the most part. Hussein was a Sunni, but they're Shiite, much more so as far as the overall numbers, and the Shiites run Iran. So much of what takes place in Iraq was, when we were losing soldiers there at alarming rates, that was really at the hands of the Iranians, and most people don't talk about that kind of stuff. Well, a Saudi Arabian diplomat said on his country doesn't want to go to war with Iran, but it will defend itself after 2 Saudi tankers were targeted by acts of sabotage off the coast of the United Arab Emirates last week. No group has claimed responsibility for the sabotage, but U.S. officials in reports signaled that Iran encouraged Iraqi-based Iranian militants to carry it out. Riyadh also accused Tehran of being behind the drone attack on 2 oil pumping stations in the kingdom, which Yemen's Iranian-aligned Houthi rebels claimed responsibility for doing. Now, here's the important part. This is, again, the problem that there is between Sunnis and Shiites. Do you realize that these are always trying to kill one another? They hate one another. Here's a really interesting little tidbit. If you try to look at where the split was in Islam, Muhammad's the guy, right? After the split, you had 2 guys. One guy named Ali, which was a stepson, and that is what we get from the Sunnis. And then there was this guy named Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr was the guy who had all the guns, but the other one was like he had the family. It's very similar to what you find with Mormons. When Joseph Smith died, it was supposed to be Joseph Jr., but Brigham Young had the numbers. So Brigham Young takes over. Really interesting how that works. So the 2 factions, one becomes kind of with family ties. The other one is like the right hand, Abu Bakr, who had a whole lot more pull, and really he had the numbers. And so he kind of took Islam in that direction. So what you have, they hate one another. They will kill one another with impunity, but the one thing you can get them to agree upon, their hatred for Israel. They will quit killing one another long enough if Israel is able to be, or us, if they can get at the U.S. So, with that in mind, that helps with a little bit more of what we're going to be reading. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia does not want war in the region and does not strive for that, but at the same time, if the other side chooses war, the kingdom will fight this with all force and determination, and it will defend itself and its citizens and its interests. The top commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps and the country's the elite fighting force echoed the same sentiments through state media on Sunday. So Iran, Shiite. The Saudis, Sunni. Okay, that's really ultimately it. So when you hear Yemen, Yemen is Shiite, and it's right on the border with Saudi Arabia. So if you know who the players are, and you can't know any of the players without a program, if you've ever been to a baseball game, the program basically will tell you, if you know whose side they're on, it'll explain why they're fighting. So Iran is not looking for any type of war, but it is fully prepared to defend itself, said Major Hussein Salami. Isn't that great? You didn't know that there were Italian guys there, huh? So anyway, sorry, couldn't help it. Tensions have been heightened between Washington and Tehran after reports said that Iran was planning to carry out attacks on American troops and ships in the region. Now there's the important part. There is no place where you've heard it said. This is the chatter that's going on, and it's why we are beefing up all of our activity in the area, but it really heightens the tensions quite a bit. There's another report that'll show our intelligence has picked up on some things. Now, earlier this month, the White House sent warships and bombers into the Persian Gulf to counter any threats from Iran and evacuated non-emergency personnel from Iraq. How many of you guys knew that? We've taken non-essential people out of the nation of Iraq. That's a big deal. So what do they know? Hard to say, but it's enough that it's actionable. Now, has Iran hated us from the very beginning? Of course they have. So why now? Why the difference? Don't know, but stay tuned. Another article that really kind of deals with the same thing, but it has a little bit more detail. Listen to this. The current tensions are rooted in Trump's decision last year to withdraw the United States from the 2015 nuclear accord between Iran and world powers and impose wide-reaching sanctions, including on Iranian oil exports that are crucial to its economy. If we want to know what it is, they're feeling now the bite of us saying, that stupid treaty, we had no business getting involved with it, and things went back to the way that they were. Most people don't realize it, but Iran is in desperate need of some help. They are really hemorrhaging right now. Their economy is a joke. And people are really starting to want very much to see a change take place there. And now the problem is they're probably not going to protest like they did several years ago for fear that we would do the same things that the last administration did. We did not back the people that wanted to get rid of the mullahs. I don't think they trust us as far as they could throw us, though we both want the same thing. Now, again, whatever happens in Iran, they must survive. Not because they're good, obviously, but because God has already said, and he does not do anything unless he first reveals it to his prophets. His prophet, in this case, who speaks about it a lot, Ezekiel, says they're going to be there when they move against Israel. Now, Iran has said that it would resume enriching uranium at higher levels if a new nuclear deal is not reached by July 7th. Can I tell you what that really means? They never stopped. Thank you, Gail. They never stopped. This is their way of saying, we're going to continue doing what we've done unless you go ahead and turn on the ability for us to start selling our oil again. They've been violating this from day one, and that silly thing that we put together under the last administration had no enforcement to it. We had no clue what they were doing. So it was a horrible thing to begin with. Now, they're still doing the same things that they were doing before and will continue, but they're looking for a way to get money back into the country. So that's what's being said here. Now, that would potentially bring it closer to being able to develop a nuclear weapon, something Iran insists that it has never sought. Yeah, right. They have been talking about wanting to wipe Israel off the map from as long as I can remember. And how do they plan to do that when they had the crazy last guy, Ahmadinejad? He was always talking about nuking them. Unbelievable. Okay, I'm just going to leave it at that. Energy ministers from OPEC, and it's... I remember some of the great nicknames for that guy. Anybody remember a guy named Dennis Miller? The really funny comedian guy. He used to call him Aqua Velvejad because he always had like the 5 o'clock shadow. I heard him also, what was it, a nut job and a dinner jacket? So, I'm a genocide too, I think was one I heard. So anyway, energy manager, that's a minute that I'll never get back. The energy ministers from OPEC and its allies, including major producers Saudi Arabia and Russia, are meeting together in Saudi Arabia on Sunday to discuss energy prices and production cuts. Iran's oil exports are expected to shrink further in the coming months after the U.S. stopped renewing waivers that allowed it to continue selling to some countries. Isn't it funny, because the void that is going to be left by Iran leaves the door open for Russia. Russia. Interesting, huh? First of all, I find it to be interesting that now they have so much more ability to be involved in the day-to-day dealings. They are so heavily involved with Iran and Syria. Nobody realizes just how much Russia has been able to move in there and how many things they have going on. And it's been going on for years. Frankly, our last administration helped hold the door open for them. Persian Gulf escalation. Now, this is from Reuters. Iran's frightening threat to the United States over Israel. Iran has sent a frightening warning to the United States and threatened an attack on Israel, according to reports. The United States military has sent forces, including an aircraft carrier and B-52 bombers, to the Persian Gulf to counter what U.S. officials have said are, quote, clear indications, unquote, of threats from Iran to its forces there. Now, this is just from 4 days ago. Iranian parliamentary Vice Speaker Ali Motahari told media on Sunday, that U.S. forces had begun, quote, psychological war, according to Iranian state news agency Fars. They are not ready for war, especially when Israel is within our range. Interesting. So what are you going to hit them with? Now, does that mean that you're going to do it directly from Iran if you follow through on what you say, or are you going to do it through your proxies? Are you going to do it through Syria? Are you going to try to do it through the Gaza Strip? Just recently, this happens all the time. Israel is intercepting things that are coming in through the ports, through the Mediterranean into Gaza. So that's happening all the time. They find weapons all the time, constantly. Here's a question that you have to ask yourself. Where are the rockets coming from that are coming out of Gaza? When that last volley happened in the last 2 weeks, 700 rockets came out of Gaza. 700. In a matter of 36 hours, something like that? Where did they come from? They are certainly not building them themselves. They have to be from somewhere else. Iran is where they're coming from. How are they getting in there? It's a very interesting question. With all that said, Trump's strong words came after Iran's head. This is where Trump was doing his normal tweet thing about, we'll destroy you. And Trump's strong words came after Iran's head of the Revolutionary Guard's Aerospace Division said on Sunday, if the Americans make a move, we will hit them in the head, whatever that means. So I love how these guys love hyperbole and stuff, but half the time you can't figure out what they're talking about. But anyway, commander of the Guards, commander of the Guards, this Salami guy, said he and Pepperoni, no, I'm not. said in a parliament session Sunday that the U.S. had started a psychological war in the region. So once again, here's what the question is. They think that it's a psychological war. What do they propose to do? What then are they expecting to take place next? The threat that's interesting is that they bring Israel into it. So once again, Israel is always the focus of this. Israel is, let's just make it really, really easy. Why does Israel keep coming up in this? Why is it such an issue? And the very simple explanation for it, and there is only one, a nation that is so small that's really not involved in the whole geopolitics of that whole area, aside from defending itself, it just is who they are and the land that they occupy. It is a spiritual matter, plain and simple. The devil hates them because God made a covenant with them. And so the devil stirs up his people to try to eradicate them. Again, look through history. Please point out any group of people, ethnically, that have ever been targeted for extermination aside from the Jews, to the extent that they have. For thousands of years. Why? It's disproportionate. What is the explanation why that is? There's only one that can be given, and it is a spiritual one. It's the only thing that makes sense. So with all that said, I want to kind of end the rest of the time that we have focusing on this, because I think it's very, very significant. If you've been paying attention to this for any length of time, they have been trying to do land for peace as long as I can remember. Okay, so all the way back to when Egypt and Jordan and Israel and all the Jimmy Carter was involved in the whole thing. I mean, they're trying to do this for so long. It was happening with Clinton. It happened with Bush. It happened during Obama. It's always the same thing: land for peace, land for peace, land for peace. What is interesting is the tack that they're taking with it now. Everybody to this point has always been focused on the political stuff. Always the political. How do we get land for peace? How do we have a two-state solution? How do we have this? How do we have that? They're always trying to deal with it from the political point of view. How many of you guys know that there have been so many people talking about the land for peace that we're trying to broker now? Like it's the first time that we've done it. How many of you guys have heard the reports that we are ready to launch a peace deal in the Middle East? Okay. A handful of you have heard that. Our attempt this time is radically different. Listen to this. The White House announced on Sunday afternoon the first part of the Middle East peace proposal that officials are calling an economic workshop to encourage investing capital in the West Bank, Gaza, and the region, a senior administration official tells CNN. economics. They're going right past the political. They're going past the land thing. They're trying to focus in on how do we make this viable economically. Let's stop trying to deal with the whole thing of land. Let's just deal with the prosperity, and then the rest of that stuff will follow. That's the thought. But of course, it never takes into account the spiritual problem that goes on there. That's why you'll never, in this life, short of when God says, now is the time I'll let this stuff start to roll out, it'll never happen that you will have land for peace as long as God is or as long as things are as they are now. Until God says, now's the time and I'm going to wrap things up, it can't happen. But this here is so intriguing to me because it's never been tried before, which is why people will take a second look at this thing. Kind of makes you wonder if this is the kind of thing that the Antichrist will try to use as the lever. Listen to this. Now, am I saying that Jared Kushner is the Antichrist? Seriously? Here's one thing I know for sure. The Antichrist, as evil as he is, will not be a failure. He'll do what he does, and he will be very, very effective at winning the world to himself. Okay. The workshop will take place in Manama, Bahrain on the 25th and 26th of June, just next month, bringing together finance ministers with global and regional business leaders. The effort is being headed by Jared Kushner, a senior White House advisor and president's son-in-law, Jewish man, and White House Middle East envoy Jason Greenblatt, who have spent years developing the proposal along with the much stickier political component, which officials said would be announced later in the year. They're going to deal with the political stuff after the economic stuff. I hope that you recognize how significant this is, because this is a whole different tack. This is the king's horsemen kicking out the king's men and said, we got a better way to put Humpty back together again. You get that, right? How many of you guys know the whole Humpty Dumpty thing? Nursery rhyme. Okay, Humpty falls off the wall and breaks, and the king's horsemen and the king's men. Google it, all right? Goodness gracious. I got to be careful about the kind of, examples that I give you, because I have to make sure that your brain works like mine. Which you really don't want anyway. So, okay. Asked for comment, Kushner told CNN in a statement that, quote, people are letting their grandfather's conflict destroy their children's futures. This will present an exciting, realistic, and viable pathway forward that does not currently exist. Interesting. Because they are going to try to roll out something, and he's going to basically say, you guys have been fighting over land. Why don't we deal with it from an economics point of view, and that stuff will work itself out. Let's appeal to their greed. Here's the problem. How many of you have been on the trips to Israel with us? We go through Bethlehem. It's not a lack of money. It just depends on who gets it. Because we will drive down streets and we will see palaces. And yet we'll see right next to it places that are just destroyed in squalor. It's an amazing thing. The workshop will the plan will discuss four major components, the senior administration official said. Infrastructure, industry, empowering and investing in people, and government reforms to make the area as investable as possible. Notice he's not talking about land. He's not talking about any of that stuff. Kushner said to have modeled details of the economic proposal on what was worked out in Poland, Japan, Singapore, and South Korea. Now, why would it be workable there? There's not a spiritual component. There are not two people diametrically opposed to one another based in a spiritual hatred for one another. That's why it can't work here. The workshop will attempt to studiously avoid the many political issues that have made peace so elusive for so long. That is the one thing that keeps it from happening, and it's unavoidable. So the fact that we're trying to deal with this and not deal with that, that's been the thing that causes it to wreck, and you'll see that in just a moment. Issues such as whether Palestinians will get their own state, the status of Jerusalem, measures Israel takes in the name of security, and what would happen with Palestinians and their descendants who fled or were expelled from Israel around the time of the state's creation in 1948. Finance ministers, but not foreign ministers, will be invited along with delegations of business leaders. You catch that? We'll bring the money people in, but we won't bring in the political people. And the displacement, quote unquote, let's remember, the displacement of those people happened because they tried to kill Israel when Israel agreed to a much smaller land allotment than what they ultimately got, even in 67. So, interesting. Now, verse, we're not reading from the Bible. It is a verse, it's actually a paragraph. Quote, we recognize that this needs to go hand in hand with the political plan, but this will be the first chance to roll out details of the economic plan. You notice how they're separating the two? They're putting this first. What has never happened was that they couldn't deal with the economic stuff because they couldn't get past the political stuff. So here they're saying, let's forget about the political stuff, we'll deal with that later. Let's make this so that everybody prospers. Interesting. This is fascinating to me. I can't wait to see how this all plays out. Ultimately, it's doomed to fail, and I'll get to that in just a moment. We recognize the needs go hand in hand with the political plan. So the first official, this official said, adding that this will be an opportunity to show Palestinians, Jordanians, Israelis, and the Lebanese that CEOs care about them and want to invest in the area. Lebanese, that's an interesting thing. Why not Egyptians? Not being mentioned there. And the Lebanese, what's going on in Lebanon that they would be brought into this? They had been at peace with Israel for such a long time. What happened? Hezbollah happened. Hezbollah happened. Okay? So, the second official said the workshop will focus only on the economic plan to show that you can have peace without you cannot have peace without economic stability and opportunity, but you also can't have economic opportunity and stability without peace and free from terror and resolving some of the, quote, core issues without explaining them. Let me read on. We think that this will showcase the potential of an entire region, the official said. If there is peace, it will touch on not only the West Bank and Gaza, but also on Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, and Egypt. Now they add them in. The economies will become integrated. Integrated. Now, here's what's funny. You can take Israel out of that equation, there's no integration of these other nations. They don't like each other. Why? Because you got combinations of Sunni and Shiite. And they'll fight over territory and land and money and all the rest of it. It's going to be an interesting thing. But it just shows how people can have a great idea in the earthly sense, but if there is enough of a spiritual component behind it, it can never take place. That's why it is doomed to failure. Think about how much money is spent on bullets right now, said one official. If it could be spent on infrastructure and human capital, think about how much better the region could be, which I don't disagree with that. It's just not feasible, and they don't understand why. Anybody who wants to look at this, say, why do they continue to fail? If you don't look at it from the spiritual side of it, you'll never be able to answer the question. The official denied that the rollout was being done this way so as to present a vision of a more prosperous Palestinian territory, so as to encourage greater concessions in any political talks down the line. Wow. That's called dangling the carrot. Hey man, we've come in and we've got investment. Your people are living a whole lot better. Now let's talk about the political stuff, because they're doing it in reverse order. This is some really interesting stuff. Quote, it's tough to digest both the economic and political proposals at once, since they're both very detailed proposals, one official said. It's like, quit asking questions. It's on a need-to-know basis. Let's deal with the economics first. We'll get to the political stuff later. Now make people dependent upon a government, and then you can get them to agree to just about anything. We are proving that in our country. So, asked specifically about Gaza, the official said any investment package that comes in there will have to be based on real, permanent, and verifiable ceasefire agreements. There's your poison pill. You want to know what has wrecked every single land for peace proposal? Israel says, if you want us to come to the table, and isn't this interesting? Because Israel's not even being mentioned in here, and all of this negotiating is being done on their behalf. Or so it would appear. Every time Israel comes to the table, they said, hey, we're good with that. Here's what you got to do. You got to disarm. You got to swear off terrorism. You've got to recognize our right to live in the land and be at peace with us. Poison pill. Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Authority, Al-Quds Force, you name it, all the different groups, none of them will agree to this because they will never agree to Israel. You want to know something really interesting, totally by side, just an interesting thing? I'm pulling down the street the other day, and I go to make a turn right out here onto Lincoln, and I'm right behind another car, and something on a bumper sticker, something that really, really caught my attention. Although I couldn't read it, I could make out that it was the outline of Israel. And it was with a Palestinian flag, top to bottom, colors-wise. And the woman driving it was wearing a hijab. Right here in our neighborhood, and I thought, that's an interesting thing. So where we are, and the recognition, again, of what's happening in that part of the world, the bottom line to it, if you try to go back in history, there have never been a, quote, Palestinian people. They've never had a government. They've never had denominations of coin. They've never had an infrastructure. They've never had anything. There have never been a, quote, Palestinian people. It's a fabrication. And it couldn't have even existed until Israel was in the land because there wouldn't have been a need for it. So it is just basically those people that live in that area are either Jordanian at one point. They may have lived in the area, but they came from somewhere. But they were not governing the place. Look at what Mark Twain had to say about it. He went and visited. So anyway, I got to do this because we're out of time. On Sunday afternoon, however, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas spokesman Nabil, this guy, told CNN that the plan was futile. Here is what is left of Arafat's old bunch. It's futile. It's useless. It's not going to work. Any economic plan without political horizons will lead nowhere, he said, adding Palestinians will not accept any proposal which does not include a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. So, Jared, you've got a great plan. But it'll never work because the people that have to agree with it will never agree to it. And I am out of time on that. I want to do one thing. I think this is very, very well done. I'm going to do the one video, the one that Prager did. There is also, look this up for yourself. There is a very interesting video, and we don't have time for it. In fact, we're going to run a little bit over by doing this. There's a great video that if you haven't seen it, if you go to YouTube and just put in 2 words, FAT, F-A-T, FAT, Gaza, G-A-Z-A. What that simply, yeah, we won't play that one. That's Fat Gaza. Let's not play that one. Go watch that one yourself. And the reason it's called Fat Gaza is that you hear, I've heard it referred to that Gaza and the West Bank are the world's largest outdoor prisons. Most ridiculous thing I've ever said. Said by a guy named Donald Miller last time I heard it said. That's a whole different story. The guy's supposed to be an evangelical.
There are 100.
Is that the one? This is one of them that's interesting. Darn, that's not the one I was thinking. But anyway, we'll play this one anyhow. The important part of again, all of what you see taking place, when it comes to Gaza, we are told that they are being starved and that Israel is starving them by not letting things come in. You go watch that and you'll see the amount of things that come into Gaza, and it is paid for by other countries. They will show you that per capita, the people in Gaza get more direct financial aid from the world than any other group of people on the planet. And yet they live like it's like being rats. They live like rodents. But the people of Hamas do quite well. So, very instructive. Let's watch this one. I think you'll find this interesting.
93 countries in the United Nations today. Of these, one has been singled out as an especially egregious offender of the organization's mandate to preserve and enhance human freedom and tolerance. Can you guess which it is? It has about 7 million citizens, of whom a fifth are Arab. The government is vibrantly democratic, its press wide open, and religious freedom fully respected. Women have equal rights and gays live openly. The answer is Israel. Here are some facts. 38% of all the resolutions of the United Nations Human Rights Council, the UN's top human rights body, that are critical of specific countries have been directed at Israel alone. The Council has a permanent agenda that governs every regular session. This agenda is composed of 10 items, one of which is always reserved for criticizing Israel. Between 2006, when the Council was created, and 2012, it published 48 reports condemning Israel. During that same period, there were 9 reports on Syria's mass killings and torture of its own citizens, 3 on Iran's genocide-threatening regime, and not one on, for example, China, which denies more than 1 billion people elementary freedoms. I could go on, but I think you get the idea. So we are faced with a choice. Either there's something very wrong with Israel that I'm not telling you about, or there's something very wrong with the United Nations that you should know about. Let's look into the history of both. First, Israel. Ever since its establishment, voted for by the United Nations, by the way, in 1948, Israel has had to fight its neighbors solely in order to survive. It has endured innumerable acts of terrorism, the most intense from 2000 to 2005, the so-called Second Intifada, in which children and other innocents were blown up in places like pizza parlors and buses and at weddings. It still suffers from rocket attacks against civilians from the Gaza Strip, which is controlled by a terror group, Hamas, whose stated reason for existence is to destroy Israel. Israel has developed a strong military and a web of security fences and walls to protect itself. Do these security measures cause hardships to people who must deal with this network? Yes, they do. Israel would like nothing better than to tear all these fences and walls down. But bitter experience informs it as to what would happen if it did. Is Israel a perfect country? Of course not. But it is one of the freest and most open societies in the world. That's Israel's history. Here's the UN's. In 1949, when the UN admitted Israel as a member state, the UN had 58 member countries and a clear democratic and pro-Western orientation. Today, the UN has 193 member countries, most of which are not even free. Among its many negative changes, the UN changed the principle of self-determination from a post-World War II, post-Holocaust human rights principle to a tool to wield against the West, especially against Israel. This reached its fullest expression at the notorious Durban Conference, held in South Africa in 2001. The Durban Conference was billed as a UN World Conference against racism and intolerance, but it turned into an orgy of anti-Israel and anti-Jew propaganda. Of all the bad actors in the world, the final Durban Declaration found one state guilty of racial discrimination. You guessed it, Israel. The Durban Declaration, however, remains to this day the centerpiece of the UN's allegedly anti-racism agenda. There's only one country in the world whose very legitimacy is questioned. Only one country that is openly threatened with annihilation. That country is Israel. And what has the United Nations done about it? Worse than nothing. It has itself become a global platform for anti-Semitism and the destruction of the Jewish state. I'm Ann Bayevsky, Director of the Touro Human Rights Institute for Prager University.
The Prager University website is phenomenal with those kinds of things. There are so many really good, informative, just 5-minute videos that have so much information. They're terrific. This wasn't the one I was going to show you. I thought I had a different one queued up. But it is interesting given what we just looked at, because here, let me make a prediction. When they roll this whole thing out and when it finally blows up, Israel will get blamed for it. And the interesting thing is that the UN will have all kinds of meetings and declarations about why Israel didn't agree to it. If it goes as they all seem to, Israel said, we're in, let's do this. If and they put these stipulations in it that you'll recognize the things that I had said before. Recognize us, swear off terrorism, put down your weapons, all that kind of stuff, and we'll discuss land. They'll never agree to it, but Israel will be seen as the bad guy, guaranteed. And the UN will be carrying the water for that group. Going to be interesting.